As stated in its core values, Loyola Marymount University is committed to confronting social injustice and threats to human dignity. Throughout the school's history, many LMU students have passionately fought for social justice, though there has been an ebb and flow to this activist spirit across the generations. From the heyday of student activism in the Vietnam War and Civil Rights era, to today's resurgence in the wake of Donald Trump's election, activism at LMU has been a complicated topic. Over the next 3 episodes, we will explore 3 generations of LMU students and how national events inspired them to take action. This is Generations of Activism.
I arrived here in the fall of 1968, and so orientation was my first introduction to the anti-war movement. There was a dinner and an evening on the quad in front of what's now McKay Hall. So it was sing-alongs, there was music, and they were all anti-war songs. And it was the first time I'd been exposed to anything like that.
In the fall of 1968, the Vietnam War was in full swing. Martin Luther King and Robert Kennedy had been assassinated earlier that year. Richard Nixon would soon be elected President of the United States. And in Los Angeles, Loyola University and Marymount College began the affiliation that would lead to an official merger 5 years later. Across the country, children of the post-World War II population explosion, known as the baby boomers, were now in college, and determined to fight against what they saw as profound injustices in society.
Students at LMU didn't respond differently than students all throughout the United States.
Stephen Bradley is a professor at LMU and chair of the African American Studies Department. He has researched and written extensively about student activism, particularly during the 1960s.
Young people, particularly college students, during the period of the Vietnam War were very much alive. In addition to dating and partying and everything else, they were very concerned with sharing their voice in society. You have to remember that at this time in history, there were more young people than there were old people. There were more people under the age of 25 than there were older than 25 in the United States. And so young people believed that they had a responsibility to improve society, that the older generation had taken their turn in ruining society, and that their voice should be heard and count as much as anybody else's.
I was very politically active personally. Much to my father's dismay, he couldn't understand how a good Republican father could end up with such a Democratic daughter. And he would torment himself all the time about where did he go wrong. Every year he got grapes from California, shipped to Indiana, and then he would make 2 barrels of wine. Okay. And I came back from California my first year here, so that was 65, 66. And Cesar Chavez was very prominent at the time. My father was furious at me for having the grapes go up 25 cents a pound, right? And did I understand what that was going to do to the price of making 2 barrels of wine?
Students at the soon-to-be Loyola Marymount University, like most college students in the 60s and early 70s, were fervently opposed to the Vietnam War. At LMU, active resistance to the war mainly took the form of participation in national protests. Students held marches and rallies to coincide with nationwide demonstrations for peace.
If they were not in college, they would face the draft. Their peers were going off to fight in the war.
You could very well be drafted and go over to Vietnam and die. And so there was a real reason to be invested.
I was not formally involved in groups, but there was a lot going on because of the Vietnam War. So there was the October 15th protest, I think it was 1969, the fall of 1969, where everything was suspended. And students had a choice of either going to class or not going to class. So of course I was part of that walkout. And then in the spring, I believe it was 1970, there was the invasion of Cambodia. and I was part of the May 1st protest march. And so we marched from campus through Westchester with carrying signs and pickets and that sort of thing.
You know, it was the era of sex, drugs, and rock and roll. So there was also kind of an anti-authoritarian spirit that spread on campus.
The spirit of the 60s was alive and well on campus. The Loyolan maintained an anti-war stance, male students burned draft cards, but the campus was never exactly a flashpoint for the anti-war movement.
Well, I think we were all just on edge as students, trying to figure out what was happening with the government. There was an increasing distrust and discontent with the government.
But it was still fundamentally a pretty conservative campus.
We were certainly not Cal Berkeley in the 60s, you know. So there was Cal Berkeley and there was Madison, Wisconsin, Columbia University in New York were really the hotbeds of activism, and we were not that.
I'd say the conservatism came from the demographics of the students and from the families they were coming from. It came from a conservative Catholicism that existed in Los Angeles and Southern California.
A lot of us came out of Catholic schools and being much more in tune to rules and hierarchy, I would imagine.
But there was other, more radical activism happening on campus as well. For the first time, black students were organizing to make their voice heard at LMU.
The students across the nation were organizing to create a presence for black students on predominantly white campuses. This happened here at LMU with the formation of the Black Student Union.
We know that the so-called big class of LMU comes in 1967 with a numbering of about 13, and found the campus to be, when I say campus, I mean administration, I mean faculty, as well as students. From the perspective of those black students who were coming in, found it unwelcoming. Nowadays we would call them microaggressions. A lot of different microaggressions, i.e. speaking for all black people when you're in class. Right? You're the lone black person in class, all the heads turn to that one individual. So what do black people think? I don't know, I haven't surveyed all of them, but just, you know, but that takes its toll. There was a survey that was done in the Loyolan, interviewing students around campus about, you know, the racial climate on campus, and should, you know, some of these classes be offered, like a Black history class or an African history class. The campus is largely split, you know, with some comments being, well, hey, I don't see race, I treat people the way in which they treat me. Others saying, well, you want to solve the problem, send them back to Africa, right? So this is the climate that they found themselves in.
In the fall of 1968, black students at LMU took action to address racial tensions and discrimination on campus. They repeatedly urged University President Charles Casasa to establish an African American Studies program and set aside funds in the library to acquire books on black history. When Casasa refused, students formed the Black Student Union to better organize their efforts, lobbying the administration and board of trustees to take action.
When they formed the BSU, and they said they no longer Negroes, they black, and this politicized blackness as they understood it, that it was received with by some with a lot of malice. That February, Black History Week, it's still a week at this point, Black History Week, and one of the guys draws a posters. John Carlos, Tommy Smith, remember the '68 Olympics that just happened, and the whole theme around it was Black is, right? And so they had posters going around, and so some of the guys, the white guys on campus, defaced them. You know, Black is, you know, and all these derogatories, all these, you know, expletives. And so, well, they took some of those, and they would, you know, they knew where the black guys lived in Wayland and what have you, and so, you know, started taking those posters and stuffing them under the doors in their rooms. Well, that wasn't taken too kindly, so some of the brothers got together and started going door to door, knocking, who did this? And if they didn't like the answer they got, well, there were some physical altercations that came after that.
Eventually, though, the climates in the country and on campus began to change. The draft ended in 1973, and the civil rights and Black Power movements waned as the decade wore on. The administration and the student body of the university underwent shifts, and the activist spirit that had thrived in the 60s and early 70s began to transform.
I wouldn't say that the activist climate faded away as much as students graduated, right? Students graduated with a different crop of students cycling in.
The universities start to learn how to deal with activist students, and so one of the ways to deal with activist students is to give them a larger voice in the decision making of the university. And so this is where you start to see universities beefing up their student body government to where there would be representatives on the board of trustees, where there would be maybe a clearer line of communication between students and administration.
President Merrifield is key, I think, because I think had Father Consasa stayed as president even a year longer, even a semester longer, we'd be having a different conversation. He seemed to have been more, by today's standards, be more progressive, seemed to have been more willing to listen. What we don't know is his intentions. Was he really believing in the things that he was saying and doing, or did he understand as president of an institution that what we have to do is save the institution from implosion? But what I do know is what happened afterwards, and that is putting into place resources, right? Such as the Afro-American Studies program that initially gave rise to what we now refer to as the Office of Black Student Services, in the African American Studies program, some responsiveness now to the things that the students have been trying to address.
Ethnic studies in general is a legacy of this particular moment of the 1960s, and you see the rise of not only Afro-American studies or Black studies, but you see the rise of Latino studies and Asian American studies and women and gender studies throughout the 1970s and 1980s.
Those institutions, those movement organizations are still in place to do what they've done for nearly 50 years now. The BSU 50 and these other ones are coming up on 50. That's why I say it's not that it's that it waned, right? It transformed, right? Because movements come to an end. They now become the watchdogs, if you will, to continue to monitor and be a resource the same as it was intended to be in the 60s and 70s.